We start with deep ethical issues and end at ancient Norse rap battles. Keep listening.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. I have an amazing interview today, but first, really quickly, guys, if you like this podcast, please consider supporting it in some way. Leave me an honest review, like it, subscribe it, rate it. All those things would be much appreciated. How many people like or rate or subscribe or review your podcast goes into the various algorithms and makes the show more likely to appear in somebody's pod feed or whatever they're listening to. And I would really love it if more and more people listen to the show, because I think this podcast has a unique place in the RPG podcast space, because we are talking about topics and subjects and ideas that I don't hear discussed on a lot of other podcasts. So if you could do one of those things, that would be great. Well, enough of all that. Here's the interview. It is my pleasure to welcome a returning guest to the show today. He is an RPG designer as well as an archaeologist, Scott Smallwood. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, it is really awesome to have you back on. A lot of people really resonated with the first episode when we talked about cultural respect. So it is a pleasure to have you back on the show today.
It's very nice to be back. I look forward to talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so since in the first episode, we talked all about kind of your RPG history and that, we'll skip all of that. And I wanted to jump into some more of your thoughts and perspectives as an archaeologist. So kind of, a few years ago, at least, I remember reading an article. It was on one of the newspaper websites. I live in Missouri. It was about an incident that happened in, I think it was southwestern Missouri. Some people went into a protected Native American site, and they looted it. They destroyed objects. They were trying to sell them. As I'm reading the article, I'm horrified by what happened. And of course, the people were arrested and they were put in jail, or at least one of them did. And I think they were fined as well. I want to get your thoughts about this, because in some regards, that's what some people say that player characters do when we're playing Dungeons and Dragons, or when we're, playing a role-playing game. Some people say that that's exactly what our player characters are doing. And of course, in real life, I would never do something like that. I'm sure you're horrified by stories like that as well. I want to kind of get your take on this, because I never really imagined that's what player characters were doing. I always imagined, like in Dungeons and Dragons specifically, a group of characters go into a dungeon. Well, I always imagined that the dungeon was built like 1,000 years ago by an evil wizard who stole all of his wealth and money. And the monsters that live in there are terrible abominations and creatures that look to destroy people. So if you're in there in the dungeon, you're not looting a place. You're actually recovering treasures that were stolen. So those are just some of my thoughts, and hopefully, we can have a discussion here today. What are some of your thoughts on the situation that I kind of outlined there?
Okay, so it's a big question, a lot of stuff to unpack. To the situation in and of itself, that is I believe that's you're referencing the Mark Twain National Forest ARPA violation by 2 to 3 individuals who were involved with it, but it ended up being like 5 to 7 total, if I remember correctly.
Oh, okay.
It's been a minute since I've read the case law on it.
Sure.
We try to keep up to date on things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So in that particular situation, what happened was, this speaks not only to this speaks to an intersectionality between cultural respect for the Native Americans whose archaeological site, burial grounds, and materials were ripped from the ground without, one, their permission, two, by a professional, or three, by somebody with respect. And rural America, and the problems that that it's having, in particular with regard to meth and painkillers and some of the other things too, with regard to that. So you're looking at a variety of issues.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, it's not uncommon. I'm just going to be upfront with that. I've been on a site within the last 3 months, 4 months ish, that was looted, and I was documenting that. It is what it is, and that's a bad way of saying it, and it's a very simple way of putting it. That said, robust laws like ARPA, which is Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which is how these individuals were persecuted since it was on federal property. They became, this is public land. They came onto public land, dug artifacts without permission, to remove those artifacts, took them back, attempted to sell them to procure more money for whatever reason. Oftentimes here in Arkansas, we've heard of people. We've heard of groups of people like Meth Cooker, who's not using a product, will have, he knows they know the people addicted to it don't have the money to give him anymore, so they're asking for stuff like stealing catalytic converters off vehicles, or if they know a good pot hunting place, they go out and pot hunt. For a lack of a better way of putting it, it's genocide. You're removing somebody's cultural heritage from the landscape in a very, very aggressive way. And so it's the reasoning behind it, regardless, whatever the rural perspective is, they're using these other sites, because they're not going to Anglo-American cemeteries. They're not going to other places like that. They're specifically targeting places with Native American burials. They're targeting places that have religious imagery and stuff like that. And so you have those concerns in general with that. And so, yeah, it is terrifying, and yes, it is worrisome from that perspective. Now, these individuals were prosecuted under the fullest extent of the law because this occurred on federal property. And so what that means, they get jail time, they get, they have to pay fines, which we could go on for hours about whether that's actually going to do anything worthwhile. Now, to pull that away from the individuals who did this, now going to the materials they affected, or materials affected at similar sites, or even on other types of sites, is you have to consider that when you start finding artifacts that are, these beautiful pieces, these beautiful ceramic pieces, or these, a lot of tools, and the soil is dark, that you're probably near a village site, which just like today, our villages have cemeteries, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're affecting cemeteries. So from that perspective, which is why I use the term genocide, we're literally, one culture is literally, whether the culture desires it or not, is literally attacking and assaulting the remains of another culture and removing that from the landscape. So that's where the word genocide comes in, and we can go further into that. And there's other this is a big fraught ethical topic within the field, and and we can kind of go through each steps, and I could probably have 3 or 4 hours to discuss it because it is a lot. So we're talking about now to go from there and moving on to the concept of what is looting versus or treasure hunting versus archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
Archaeologists are scientists. Doctors are scientists, right? What's a doctor have to have?
A license.
A license, but also what is a doctor? Well, the irony is archaeologists don't have licensing committees.
Oh, okay.
Which is personal opinion here, and the archaeological community might needle me for this if they hear it. We need a body who governs with a license. Now we have professional organizations, of which I am a member, and I meet the qualifications under the federal guidelines. So cool. I have the expertise to be an archaeologist. The point I'm going toward here is that for a doctor to study a patient or to work with a patient, what does a doctor need from the patient? Permission and informed consent.
Mm-hmm.
We're working with descendant communities. Often, the majority of the time, Native American descendant communities. But not all the time. We're working with a variety of marginalized communities and sometimes not marginalized communities. But we need the time to explain what we're doing, why we need to do it, what's happening, and get the permission of the people to whom that site is related for us to do our work there. Without those things, regardless of whether I have the credentials in my opinion or not, if I go to a tribe and say, well, I want to study this site because of this, and this, I need to do this type of ground disturbing testing. I'm going to curate the artifacts here, and I give them a plan, and they still say no. The answer is no. And it doesn't. And if I go out and I put a hole in the ground there because dang it, that's my study, I'm violating an ethical responsibility I have to the descendants of those people who have given me an answer of no. And regardless of that, it's looting. And so that's where the line is you need to be a professional. You've got to get your expertise. You've got to get your time in. You've got to get, go get your schooling, get your fieldwork experience, get your field school, take the time and the effort to understand the laws and the ethics and the concerns of the people who are related to that locality. And yes, I understand we get to the point of multivocality, like we can go talk about Stonehenge for the next 4 hours about the different voices who are important for it and who gets to say what, and are the people who look at healing crystals allowed to have an equal voice to individuals who are native to wells in the area from which the bluestones came. And I mean that is a discussion that we could have for an extensive period of time. But in the end, what it comes back to is I have to get permission. And my goal is to ensure that site that was intended to remain on the landscape for as long as possible stays there as long as it can. And nobody wants to move the grandmother out of the grave in which she was buried. Nobody. I mean, you might run into situations where rivers are taking cemeteries, which is something that happens. You live in Missouri, the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River does what it wants. It cuts into its old courses that have been built up on. You've got a cemetery up there. Yes, sometimes the Corps might say, hey, we need to move the cemetery. And we're going to do this. What do you think? What would you like us to do? How would you like this to be done? And that's one way to handle that. So, okay, that's two of the points there. So we talked about the multiple concerns. We talked about that, and then how it relates to the lighthearted subject of role playing games.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've kind of beat the drum pretty hard there about don't put a hole in the ground unless you do this. And now we're going to talk about the role playing games. Okay, so it depends on how you phrase it. Like you said, you brought up this idea. Here's this 1,000-year-old keep that was built by this great wizard this great evil wizard who this great evil. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to roll with your analogy.
Yeah, who stole everything? Like
Who
his
stole
wealth,
everything.
or he just stole everything. Yeah.
Okay, so the players are going to go fight this. Now he's a lich. They're going to go in there. They're going to clear the dungeon, defeat the lich, take the goods back, and be adequately rewarded for their heroic deeds and their wondrous behavior, and all those other things. That story is far different than the story of archaeology.
Sure.
Unfortunately, the story of archaeology, especially the United States, begins. Well, I say United States, probably United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States. We're an arm of colonialism. There's no other way to put it. We are going out, finding artifacts, finding artifacts of the cultures we have subjugated, bringing them back, putting them in a museum without their permission, often from graves, to show them, look, these were the people. Look at, and oftentimes the intonation is always, look at how backwards they were compared to our industrial power. That is the issue with the history of archaeology, and why things like what I talked about earlier, informed consent, working with dissident communities, designing collaborative research projects, all these other things are super, super, super important for decolonializing archaeology. But to sort of run a decolonial perspective at a table, your idea of the heroes going in to defeat the evil wizard, that's one thing, right? Mm-hmm. They're going in, they're defeating an evil wizard. Okay, so they bring the goods back out. Who do they give the goods back to? Maybe they give them back to they donate the money back to the local population who is subjugated by this horrible lich. Maybe they keep it all. Who knows? But it's still a different story than I am a conqueror. I am a part of a conquering group of people. The people we subjugate have burial mounds and other such objects that they wanted protected. So the point of my campaign is the point of this campaign is we're going to go get rich. We're going to go become powerful adventurers and do our thing. And then we start out the campaign by attacking this subjugated people's burial grounds or ruined keeps associated with their culture. You're getting into that level of what is getting close to that red line. Because you have to be careful. In reality, in history, is that really what happened between petty kingdoms? And maybe, I mean, when the Romans invaded Britain, and they could not defeat the pre-Roman British folks, resoundingly, they tried trade. Well, that worked with one tribe, didn't work with another, and so they had to fight a war. Well, that tribe lost, and then they had to fight another war, and eventually it got so frustrating and so time-consuming and so resource-intensive for them that they used informants to figure out where the groves were, attacked Anglesey, burnt the whole island, and leveled every last grove. It's awful. I mean, that level of genocide is stomach twisting. But it's no less disgusting than what we've done here, and what the United States has done with regard to that. And it's why archaeologists have to get better. It's why we have to keep that ethical issues in mind. So my point is you want to stay away from that. If you're trying to teach, if one of your aims is teaching that decolonization is an important aspect, is an important thing for other people to understand at your table, then you need to focus on exploring that from a different perspective or a different way, rather than getting in there and really just leaning into, oh, let's go get so and so's artifacts, because, well, this keep is associated with somebody who's super powerful and super important with regard to these people that no longer exist. Well, like I said, there's a big difference between the Lost Island of Castamere from first edition or Into the Borderlands or what was that, Expedition to Barrier Peaks and stuff like that, versus even Sunless Citadel to some extent from third edition, where Sunless Citadel, you're going into this place of religious fervor, and yes, it's been overtaken by other people, but some of the things in there belong to people who no longer exist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, a little bit. And I know there's a lot of issues here, and of course, talking about real world archaeology, and in that there are so many considerations that I'm sure that you have to take into account. And I'm just wondering, because I've seen the spillover into role-playing games, which I think me and others and you possibly, this is our entertainment, this is what we're doing for fun. So and I think you even mentioned like lighthearted kind of so I'm just wondering then, I know last time we talked a little bit about some of the cultural respect, but I'm just wondering then, how would you handle it at your table? So your characters are, wandering adventurers, and here is a ruin. How do you handle that at the table? Do you just, take into account some of those, kind of those ethical questions, or do you just paint it in broad strokes, kind of like my example?
Depends on what the effort. One, my products tend to use a lot of open space what the players put into it, so my players don't tend to go that way anyway. So that's one thing that's going for me. But two, I have written and I have on the back burner for another product that I'll be trying to work on later this year, if I can ever get time again to do that, to talk about particular aspects of colonialism. I mean, even down to and how that works. Has it come up in play? Yes, it has. It's a fantastic story. So you can tell, and I think one of the analogies I used last time was talking about mounds. Mounds are important sites throughout Europe, in places where stone, in the United States, where places where stone is not as available in quantities like where it was in Central America or the Middle East, to make pyramids and ziggurats and all those wonderful civic ceremonial buildings that designate powerful people and powerful places. I usually give the mound some sort of sentience. I give a good example is the mounds in Grunmark. Grunmark is a folka in the Hoyland setting, and it's a series of burial mounds associated with one family. It's also addressed in a short adventure I put out a while back called Burden. And there is a curse, no, a curse. There is a spell on the burial ground. Burial ground, that if you bring the intention to steal on there and you die, you will raise to protect it. That is something that comes, like, that's something that is mentioned, I believe. I'm going to probably mess this up because I've got so many different things in my head right now, but I think it's mentioned in Norse lore. So these other ideas of there is something dissuading you from this location, or there is something at this location who will talk to you about it and bring it up to you. So in this case, there is a guardian of this area. They will appear and they'll have a discussion. They'll present you lay the cards on the table and say, hey, instead of looting this, I will give you something if you go help me, if you go take care of these looters, this band of looters that keep attacking us. So your party, instead of going into the keep, goes over there. So I usually reframe it that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Turn it into a story of, honoring the guardian, honoring the ancestors, honoring the spirits that ask you the questions there.
Okay.
I mean, there's that wonderful story of Groa and her son Svipdagur from a Norse myth, where Groa dies, and she knows her son's going to need her because she knows the woman who's going to marry her husband. Groa is a great seer. She knows the woman that is going to marry her husband after she's gone, is a terrible woman who will want her own sons to have fortune over Svipdagur. So the stepmother later on in life challenges Svipdagur, sends him out and says, if you want to have anything in this, you've got to win the hand of this woman by love, not by force, or something of that nature. I can't remember the central aspect of it there, but he has a card up his sleeve. He has the spell to go awaken the spirit of his mother at her burial mound. So he goes to her burial mound, casts that spell. She wakes up, casts 9 spells on him to protect him on his journey, and then goes back to rest. And her spirit finally moves on to the afterlife when he completes his job. And so there are ways to honor these stories without being offensive, without being, how do I put this? What's the phrase I'm going for, Matt?
Without being destructive or
destructive, without being colonialist,
Yeah.
without looking at this from that perspective of being like, we're going to take this over and do this. There are ways to do it, and it's just not doing it. It just literally it's an easy choice. Instead of telling the story where we go fight this band of savage people and, oh, look at this great stuff that they've got. It's one thing to present orcs as pig-faced humanoids who are, pig-faced magically enchanted humanoids who are created out of the ground by an evil wizard.
Yeah.
I know there are problems associated with that even still, but there's a little difference versus a unique society who has kinship relations and, has children. They have, when you start getting into orcs have society and culture versus they're the constructs of an evil wizard, you are breaking that line between fantasy creation to something that is that is asking the question of what is human and what does that mean, and what does it mean to deal with folks like orcs who are in this primitive culture, quote unquote, who are in this culture that, you know, is very nomadic, and they have their own kinship ways. And that's I'm trying to remember how 5e portrays it. But that's in and of itself to me is problematic, because if you're going to have orcs who have kinship, who understand the idea of kinship relations, and and husband, there's parents bring forth a child, this child is raised in their culture, this culture does this. Cultures are neither inherent. This is where cultural relativism comes in. Cultures are neither inherently evil or good. And I think Loki, oh God, hopefully people have watched this 5 weeks from now when this airs.
I haven't yet, but
okay,
go ahead.
I will spoil one sentence, and it's a good one, but I won't
fine.
say what he's directed it to. Loki has a great quote: "Not all which is good is purely good, and not all which is evil is purely evil." That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I'd need to chew on that a little bit more, but and I think you do bring up an interesting point there as well, and about orcs and that, because that was another thing that I always, maybe it was because of reading Tolkien or whatever, I had always thought of orcs as, just a construct, a mocking construct with no sentience or soul, right? Like they may have some type of cognizance, obviously, because they can make weapons and things, but they can't do anything else. So I was kind of some time ago, I was out of D&D for a while, and then got back in kind of at the tail end of 4th and back into 5th. I was kind of surprised to see how orcs were being treated as, just like a different species, just as a different group that has, as you were saying, has a culture and has marriage and has, and has children and stuff, because that was, and I found that a bit shocking, because I was just like, no, they don't. They're, I don't know, like I don't have it all worked out as how they multiply or whatever, but it was just like they don't have souls. They don't have those. They're just a mocking creation that was, brought forth to plague, the real, species and races,
brought
in the
forth
land
by Melkor to in Sauron to pervert elves, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I was like, yeah.
And I, and I get that. And again, it is a slight, but that slight rephrasing from Wizards creation without culture, or not without culture, but there's a way to say this.
Like without like personhood or sentience of some sort.
Yeah, it's almost lacking sentience to some degree, as presented, and I realize that Tolkien has its problematic aspects, and I'm not going to get into that here, but it's the moment the moment you start rephrasing goblin society, then you get into these questions of, let's see, what's the Treasure Island first edition where you run in? No, that was goblins versus orcs. Or adventures that I see, some mentions I see online is this thing where, oh, well, there are goblin babies in this cave. Well,
oh gosh,
it's people talking about that, and this being sort of the litmus test between, am I going to keep DMing for this group or not? It's like, I get that, and I understand that, and you have to. But when you get to the point where you're talking about beings with a level of with a level of cultural insentience, history, knowledge, and historical understanding. Because that's the thing I think bothers people most, and things that people forget about real world cultures who don't have writing, is that oftentimes we overlook, well, they didn't document anything. This is something you'll hear. It's like, well, so what? Their oral history is their documentation. And so if you frame orcs in a similar sense as that type of culture, then you cannot treat them like, oh, they're just chaotic evil. They're just chaotic evil, crazy people that come and raid villages all the time. They've got a reason why they're raiding.
Yeah.
And you need to find out why. They cannot be your straw man for the sake of being your straw man in that way anymore. And that's just, you just can't do that. And I don't know any other way to get around it but to say that no culture, not even orcs, is evil in that setting. If orcs have all the same biological functions of humans, and elves have all the same biological functions of humans, goblins, everything else like that, you cannot get away with saying that any of these cultural entities are good and they are evil. They are both. And that duality exists in and of itself. And it's why I wrote A State of Being, because good and evil are concepts, wonderful shorthands to talk about in D&D, to talk about the difference between utilitarianism versus selfishness, and then buying into your society's norms and values versus just looking at them as completely arbitrary and worthless. And so it's a shorthand. It's a problematic shorthand. That's where you start getting into the situation of, well, this orc tribe is just raiding all these villages, and well, why? Were they displaced from their homeland? Were they displaced as a result of a movement of a great red dragon in their homeland that they cannot deal with because it's impossible? Or was there another human army that pushed them north or south or whatever you need them to do? It's a far more compelling story to say orc raiding has been occurring along the hinterlands here in this kingdom. Well, okay, so you go out there, you make contact, you find out what's going on. Maybe it's the neighboring kingdom over has pushed into the lands that they said they wouldn't push into. So now you get to go resolve that. It's a much more interesting story than orc bad, human good.
Yeah, and I can see where, if you take that kind of view of orcs, that they are just another species that occupy the same territory and things like that, that at that point you would have to do that, right? Like you would have to analyze why they're attacking, why they're moving through here, why are they so aggressive, and you would have to take that into account. Like I said, I always thought that I found that interesting when, because I just had a totally different conception, right? That it was just they were the foil, right? They were the created abominations out of that attack and attack and attack because they are that thing, right? They are not a normal species. They are not a normal people that live just that are here and living around, and they were they were actually constructed for war, and they have no will beyond that, and they have no there is no orc sitting sitting on, watching a sunset, playing, a harp or whatever, because they are warriors, and that is all they know, and they have no conceptions even beyond that. So that is really interesting, and it's just interesting to see the different takes of how things have evolved. But
we talk about it as being evolved. But, you go think back to first edition, one of the playable races was half orc.
Yeah.
And so if orcs had a biological function back then.
Yeah.
And so kind of following the logic from there is where you get to the point of, okay, so this is something we've learned is problematic that we have to get past. And trying to recognize that and move beyond it, that aspect of the story, because it is problematic. There is an issue, and you've got to get past it.
Yeah. And I mean, and I've liked what you've said kind of on both accounts, like, talking about ancient cultures. I love the idea of having, a guardian or somebody there to say, hey, look, yeah, these are our sacred grounds, but these people over here are doing that. You can help us against them. You can help us by, go finding these people who are trying to destroy us. And the orcs, if your group wants to play, or your game master wants to play in the idea that they do have a full-on culture and they are full sentient, beings, that, the idea of how do we stop these raiding orc bands? Well, you find one eventually that you can talk to, right? You find one and see what is causing the issue. And so I really like the way you've kind of framed that, because it just adds layers and layers. And I think we talked about that in the first interview. To me, it just adds layers and layers on top of your storytelling and what you're able to do in your campaign. You did say something interesting a while back, though. You said your players don't usually go that way when you were talking about, like, I think just like entering a dungeon or something like that. What did you mean by that? How does your group usually how do they play, and how do they handle things like that?
The funny part is I devote a lot of time to writing, doing these combat. It's gotten better, and we'll talk about that in a bit, I'm sure. But D&D, especially first, all the editions of it have this comprehensive combat simulation, right? It's a simulation of what medieval combat would have been, or to some extent, which, of course, if you look at Greyhawk and some of the other stuff, it's actually more science fantasy ideas. And sheepishly, I must admit that the majority of play is actually more just exploration, kind of like point crawls, running into people, resolving encounters. Has combat occurred? Yes. Just had one recently that it was a one-on-one burglar versus warrior. Burglar got the drop on the warrior, decked him with a sneak attack, nearly took him out in one hit, and then it took one or two more rounds afterwards before the guy before he failed a morale check, which morale checks are super important. Failed a morale check and surrendered because he was beat. And then that turned in, so it was a 2-round combat of about a 30-minute play. And it took about 5 minutes for the combat. So 1/6 of the time playing was actually combat. The other bit of it was, wait a second, this group of people, of marginalized Listrai people, who are a people in my game world, are up here in this room, and they're doing menial tasks associated with what the bad guy's doing. Over here is a giant. What the heck's a giant doing here? The character my wife was playing decided, oh, wait a second, I'm gonna just ignore the giant because he could eat me. So she went over the other way, saw the the Lestrai folks working, and then made contact, laid eyes on the bad guy. It's like, okay, so there's a couple ideas here. I could leave, go get the guards and have them come help me, and run the risk of the guy getting away. So she decided, okay, well, I'm going to go do this. So she got him, took care of him. There's a long story why she's working with guards, by the way, mostly on the fact of, I want a paycheck, and I found out that my paycheck is a lot better if I just help people do this instead of stealing crap. But okay. So for now, that's the way it's working. So anyway, she beats this guy, gets him out. She gets everybody down there. They goes into another discussion between magic users going and messing with this giant. Giants haven't been seen in a long time. And then the Listrai commander of the keep nearby is trying to figure out what to do with these folks who are suffering under Rivnoi, which is sort of like magical zombie of the Listrai people. And it's the storytelling is no less robust. It just doesn't ever tend to go that way. You know what I mean? The best way I can put it is instead of making a character that breaks into the keep or goes into a burial mound and pulls up whatever the great king Hrogar had in it, is not something that just tends to happen. And that I will give, to an extent, World of Warcraft some credit for pushing in me that design away from the idea of treasure hunting as an end rather than there being a story for why a location is important.
Okay. No, that was interesting. No, it was interesting to hear. Now, you have been working on a lot of RPG material since we last talked, isn't that right?
Yeah, I basically took a bunch of cut content and took a pretty good critical examination of what I was doing. I did back during Zine Quest in February, I did a State of Being, which is a 20 some odd page supplement detailing that works as an alignment replacement for your game. So it takes out lawful good to chaotic evil. You just get rid of it, take a State of Being, and drop it right in. It's available. You can snag it on our itch page or through our Gumroad store. But it's a good introduction to sort of where I think personalities and backgrounds mix to create a sort of philosophy or worldview that your character has and holds on to. Now, granted, I only wrote Western worldviews. My next step, and the step I really, really, really want to get to, is getting to a point of finding somebody from with an Eastern perspective to write worldviews that would be interesting for them if they have anything that if somebody finds something that they would like to add. I think that would be far more interesting than me trying to figure out how to adequately represent those. I am not the person who needs to do that.
Yeah, no, that sounds interesting. I know alignment can be a kind of controversial subject, or maybe not controversial, but just people have strong opinions, whether you have it, whether you don't have it, whether you use it, whether you follow it. Exactly. So that's interesting that you replace it with kind of a worldview kind of system. That's interesting.
We're currently running a Kickstarter, although it's kind of middling success, really. We're trying, but I've been very busy with work and haven't been able to devote as much time to it as I would have liked.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Kinopea. It's an urban adventure crawl. It's a sort of nuts and bolts version of our game, of the Matter of Elb. And let's see, it has no levels or classes. It has no levels or classes. It's set in sort of a fantastic Rome/Constantinople game after it got sacked.
Okay.
It's an urban tabletop role-playing game. Our goal is to look at a variety of styles: picaresque, heist, political intrigue, mystery, with a sort of centered around the idea of ether management. So what ether is magic. So the idea, sort of the history here, is you're playing a Listari, Fae from the city of Kinopea, and sometime before you were born, about 30 years before you were born, 20-ish or so, your people had been defeated by their rivals, and the city of Kinopea sacked. The then emperor defeated, and everything appeared lost until Alexianos the First figured out a way to attach the Listrai people to the ether node at the heart of Kinopea. So it's a devil's bargain. In exchange for the power to get back to get what they wanted back, he hopelessly addicted his people to magic without their permission. So their skin tones change. They're purple. There's a Byzantine term that I base this on, periphery genitos, I think is how you pronounce it. I'm awful with my Greek pronunciation. I apologize.
I think it's okay.
It means born in the purple, and what it refers to is a child born during the imperial reign. So if Emperor John the First has a child while he is called emperor, that child, as long as it's a legitimate child, is considered born in the purple. That's where that phrase comes from. So I took that phrase and took it literally and said, okay, everybody's purple. And that represents their connection to magic, how ether has twisted them. They're magical beings. And so everybody can use magic. To some extent, it's a bit Necromunda-esque, if you've ever heard of that game from Games Workshop. It's got 4 factions in it that are based off real-world political parties from Constantinople and Rome. It's got horse racing rules. It's got all sorts of stuff with that, and it's meant to look at the urban environment as what we typically use for a wilderness adventure. So in the narrator's guide, there's random generating tables to build neighborhoods, to build your city. The goal is to make an 11 by 17 map of Kinopea and give it, or Kinopea and Ontica, its port city to the north, and just basically drop, here are the important buildings. You get to design the rest. We have no actual vision for this area. You do it. Whatever your table needs, you go for it. And so that's the whole point of it, is I've got a character who's a Listrai, and every night when the sun goes down, my ether is sucked out by the ether node at the heart of town. So now I've got to have either wine or ether figs to get that back, because I can't restore it naturally on my own. And so to some extent, that horror of, I've got to be sure I have this particular resource. If I don't have it, what happens? I could get ether sick. If I get ether sick, I could turn into a Rivenoi. What to one of the Rivenoi. What a Rivenoi is essentially, like I said, I don't want to say mindless because they're not mindless at first, but they are Lustrai who have grown ether sick and now hunger and cannot sate it. And there is a way to restore them, but it's difficult and so the point is that the ultimate goal is to survive that, to survive living in a city with political intrigue and backbiting and all this other horrible things going on and getting through, being successful. And if you wish to, if that's what your group is about, doing good things, because there is always that light in the darkness in Rome. There's always that light in the darkness, especially in Constantinople. It's because you have the transition from the Roman city as a place of vice and horse racing, and by the time Constantinople rolls around, it's a place of temples and worship. It's a really cool transition from the Eastern Empire, from the Western Empire to the Eastern Empire. But long story short is that your character has to survive on these streets, and you get to control and play through that. And that's the point of it.
Okay. Well, I know it sounds like a fascinating and intricate world that you're creating in the Matter of Elb game. And I know we talked about that a little before, but just to remind everybody, where can they find the Matter of Elb and some of your other works?
Right now, our itch page is where we keep a lot of things. It's creativespheres.itch.io. And so you can find our games there. Kinopea is currently up on Kickstarter, but it will probably go to itch and with a print on demand through Lulu once we get the art for it complete and I get the editing done. It's on, that game is done and is about to be play tested by a dear friend of mine. And then the other game that I'm working on is another step closer to what Elb is going to be now, how I've changed it and sort of stripped away some of the stuff that made it a 1E, 2E clone into this sort of D&D OSR adjacent project rather than what it is now currently.
Huh. And what game is that? Is that Matter of Elb or a different one?
Hoyland.
Okay. And where can people find that one?
It is not out yet. It's still in writing and it's still working, that one. It's basically what Matter of Elb's going to be. It has levels, classes. This one is actually very close to my heart. It's got a social mechanic. You can't level in it. So when you get enough experience to gain a level, which is also referred to as renown, you have to go to a mead hall and boast. And there are another type of encounter called Folting, which is basically like, I don't know, have you ever heard of the Locusena?
No, I don't think so.
It is a text text based on an oral history of Loki insulting the gods. And they give it back just as well as he gives to them. And so it's meant to talk about sort of these I don't want to call them rap battles, but it's more just insult battles in a mead hall. It's like that happen, and it's and I give experience in it, as much experience in it as you winning a combat. So you go to the meat hall, you argue with somebody, your character wins, you get good experience, and it's meant to have that. It's meant to that whole mechanic of of boasting and reputation, renown, because that's another thing in this. There's a D10 roll for renown, so you throw the renown die, and if you roll it at or under your level, then they've heard about you. And so that's the point of Hoyland, and it's based off two wonderful quotes. But one is, well, actually, I say quotes. One is scripture, so I want to be reverent with that. But there's a wonderful quote by a Saxon priest named John of Wellingford. They'd also conquered all the country's best cities and caused many hardships for our country, for they were, according to their country's customs, in the habit of combing their hair every day, to bathe every Saturday, and to change their clothes frequently, and to draw attention to themselves. Vikings and Norse folks, right? We have this idea of, well, they were these awesome warriors. They were the cleanest amongst the things that of the tools, the tools and bits and pieces they had. They had the most objects for beautification, so it's just ripe for using that, right? It's like, so, oh well, my character has this really nice comb. I'm going to use it to get the hair's held up. Oh, hack silver. I'm going to put that. I'm going to put make a bead for my hair and put it upright, or gems, and I'm going to put that in my ring, and whatever else. And so they're doing these wonderful things, and then Havamal. The Havamal is essentially the sayings of Odin about living a good life. And so one of the verses in it is, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die. I know one thing that will never die, the fame of one who did well. Now for Shoals, the Shoals are my sort of analog, they are a little different than that. The idea of doing well is not centered just around making a lot of money and doing building these ornate, or having these ornate graves, and stuff like that. Doing well is in the sense of actually doing good, doing what is right, doing by your people. So to have a little bit of fun with that, and I just really want to. I think it's interesting. I think that history is so overlooked and forgotten. It's like, well, we look at European past is looked as being sedate as modern European culture today, and it's not. It's actually wonderfully odd and fun in its own way. Yeah. So it's you get into the problematic aspects of Norse culture, where if you reach old age as a man, you're kind of worthless. So that's a bad sort of like, well, what is that? Well, why is that? Well, the point is you were supposed to have died trying to do something to earn more fame. So the sort of Klingon-esque idea, right? It's like,
yes,
you shouldn't be why are you an old man? Old men don't deserve to be here. Yeah. And it's, so yes, is that problematic, bringing that into a game? Yes, it is, to some extent. Yeah. It's learning how to get things in a certain way, because here's something I don't ever see. The idea of sword burials. Have you ever heard of this?
I think so, but I'm sure you know a lot more about it.
Okay, so they used to take swords, because swords are very, very rare.
Yeah,
there's mostly axes, right? So you took a sword, you broke it, and when broken, you buried it, or you bent it, you did something to it so that somebody would not want to dig up your grave and steal your sword. And so that was one of the things that used to do, and that they did, and it's just fascinating how it works. That's where those cultural traditions like that I start getting interested. Things start getting fascinating, because it's It's like, well, why was this done? Well, this was done too because of that. Oh, okay, that's cool. I get you now. I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I find that fascinating. It's just a sword burial to add something like that into a game. I think that would be incredible. Um, Really anything to add some richness and depth to it, I think is awesome. But something you mentioned before, I think if you start talking about your game that is based around ancient Norse rap battles, you're probably going to sell a lot of games.
Well, I mean, it's more just insult battles. I mean,
Yeah.
it could be something more along the lines of like, because you see it in Beowulf, and it's, of course, Anglo-Saxon is a problematic terminology. All Anglo-Saxon means is Norse. They're just they're just from a different portion of the Danish peninsula than the Danes. That's really that's really all it is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if you look at that from that perspective, okay, fine. When you see it in Beowulf, you see Locus in the Locusena, which is directly from the Norse. Let's see, the fleeting Loka. I mean, of course, you don't know what he's really talking about. Some of these things you don't catch because we don't think this way anymore, and it's just wonderful.
Yeah, I bet. I know that's I've read some of the sagas and things, and it's just always hard. It's just like reading Shakespeare or something. We miss his jokes because words were pronounced differently at the time, and just different cultural things that we miss. But it is all fascinating. And so this is all in your new game that you're still working on and that is not out yet.
This is going to be a bit.
Okay. All right. Well, that's awesome. Scott, I mean, I could keep going on and just asking you more questions about games and archaeology and some of the kind of the deeper issues that we talked about, but I've had you on here a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'll make sure in the show notes for this episode, I will link up to your itch page so people can see what you have there, along with the Matter of Elb and your State of Being, kind of a replacement for the alignment system there. And then I really look forward to the insult battles from ancient Norse coming out. So maybe we'll have to have you back and we can tackle another deep, thorny problem and then talk about your game as well. But yeah, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me, Matt, and thanks for letting me talk about that. I ran the risk of getting up on my soapbox again a little bit there, but I tried to back off a little bit on the on it. But when it comes, like, just to kind of summarize, when it comes to finding archaeological materials, if you find artifacts, get with a local archaeologist, nearby university, nearby school, whatever else. Get a hold of them and be sure you talk to them and let them know what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great advice.
So, because you want to know, and please don't ever contact a Native American tribe or their historic preservation office. Get with your archaeologist and let that communication go that way. Go that way with them, because it's just gonna be better for everybody involved. You want to do let the government to government aspect work, because that's the way it's supposed to be. So if you find something, report it to an archaeologist who hopefully will do their job and report it to the right people, because that's just the way it's supposed to happen.
All right. Well, thank you for that advice, Scott. And like I said, thank you for being willing to come on the show again.
No worries, Matt. Thank you.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh my goodness, Scott brings a unique perspective to a lot of the issues that people are talking and thinking about that not only surround gaming, but around real world problems. His position as an archaeologist gives him a perspective that I think I need to hear and understand, and it is a pleasure getting to speak with him. As I mentioned in the show, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So head over there right now, find those links, and check out some of Scott's games. As you can tell from the episode, he puts a ton of work into them, thinking about cultural aspects and ethical concerns that create rich and layered gaming. So check those out, please. If you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the realm of Dice Geeks. Okay, guys, I know I said this at the top. Please, if you like the show, consider supporting it in some way. I could really use your likes and ratings and subscribes and your reviews. So please, if you would just take a few seconds or a few minutes and do one of those things, that would be fantastic. Also, if you want to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Greatly, greatly appreciated. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening today. It is my pleasure to bring you these interviews each and every Wednesday. So until next time, keep gaming!